Okay, we all know kind of about westward expansion and such, but the thing you have to understand when we talk about settlers moving westward is that there were two areas of land that were considered very sacred by the Plains Indians, and that was their prime hunting grounds and also their prime or spiritual burial grounds. And we've talked a little bit about this. In the 1850s, we had more and more white settlers moving west across the Great Plains. And where were the three areas they were going? Do we remember where they were? Where were they going to? California for the gold rush. Oregon. And those of you of LDS faith? Utah. Okay? So people were moving westward to those three areas by the 1850s. And as they were moving westward, they're traveling through these Indian prime hunting grounds and these Indian spiritual or burial grounds. And this movement of the white man westward is threatening the Plains Indians' way of life. I mean, look at it logistically. All of a sudden, if you have your family buried somewhere and these travelers are coming through and walking over the top of your parents' graves or relatives' graves, that would be irritating to you. If you had a hunting area and you go bow hunting and you have a specific area that nobody knows about and it's considered yours, and all of a sudden you go set in your tree stand and somebody's already in your tree stand, that's going to cause conflict, okay? And it was the same thing for these Plains Indians. They did not like the white man moving through their spiritual burial grounds and their hunting grounds. And as a result, these Indians began to resist. They would attack settlers, either harass them or more often kill them. And it got to be quite a tense situation for these settlers that were moving west. And so who did the settlers turn to for help when they were being attacked and harassed by Plains Indians as they traveled west? Who did they turn to?
The Army?
The government. And they said, hey, you've got to get something going here. Now, this was kind of interesting because they didn't take the Army approach at first. In 1851, what the government did is they got together with 8 different Plains Indian tribes and negotiated an agreement known in Western U.S. history as the Fort Laramie Treaty. So again, Plains Indians began to strongly resist the movement of white settlers westward. Settlers were continually attacked and killed and harassed. The settlers turned to the government for help, and the government finally in 1851 met with 8 different Plains Indian tribes, and they negotiated a treaty that we know in history as the Fort Laramie Treaty. Now, anytime you sign a treaty, it's kind of this for that. This is what you get in return for that. Well, what the Indian tribes got, and it seems kind of odd, but this is what they took, $50,000 a year, which would be about $1.6 million in today's dollars. So these 8 separate Plains Indian tribes split up $50,000 a year in exchange for guaranteeing the federal government these 2 things. Okay? So what the Indians get? $50,000 a year, which would be like $1.6 million in today's dollars, which was quite a bit of money. And they gave those 8 Plains Indian tribes that money in exchange for these 2 things. Obviously, what would be the first thing that the government would want in return for that money? No, that's a lot of kids say that. It's a good guess. They don't want their land. They want. Okay, that's the second thing. That's really good. First thing they're going to want is safe passage. The guarantee that these westward movers would not be harassed or killed. So the first thing that the government wants for their $50,000 a year is the safety of travelers moving west. You can no longer kill them and harass them and etc., etc. And Austin hit the second one on the head. The second part of the agreement for the $50,000 is that the federal government would be able to build forts along the Bozeman Trail. So for $50,000 a year, the Native Americans had to guarantee the safety of settlers traveling westward, and also they had to allow the American government to build forts along the western trails. Now, Austin, why would we want to build forts along those trails? There's actually 2 reasons why.
That way settlers can like buy and trade goods there, and they can stay there instead of having to keep
Very good. It was an outpost where they could go in and get supplies and goods, and they also could stay there. Mainly, when would they stay there? In the winter, right, because they'd be traveling and all of a sudden the weather would get bad. They didn't want to be the Donner family who got stuck in the Sierra Mountains, so it would provide them an area to go where they could spend the bad winter months. So that was one reason why. The other reason why is who occupies these forts? Military, right? So what are they going to do? Provide protection for these settlers moving west in case some of these Indian tribes didn't get the memo. Okay? So again, for $50,000 a year or $1.6 million in today's dollars that the government gave to Indians, in return they had to provide safe passage for our settlers moving west, and we had the ability or permission to build forts along the Bozeman Trail that were used for A, protection, because they were housed with military personnel, and 2, areas to stop, rest, or even stay for long periods of time and re-up their trade.
What would the Indians use the money for?
You know, it's a good question. Money was not something that Indians, you know, strive for, but I'm sure they used it. Not yet. Good guess. I'm not sure what they'd use it for. I'm sure they kept a lot of it. I don't know. Okay, back on task. Now, this Fort Laramie Treaty worked very well from 1851 to 1865. During those 14 years, payments were made, safe passage for the most part was given, forts were built, and everything was hunky-dory for those 14 years. But by 1866, something had occurred and ended that changed the Indians' philosophy on this. Anybody know what that might be? What changed and ended in 1866? Come on now. The Civil War. Very good. And how good a shape were these Southerners in after the Civil War? Not very good. So their life, you know, was in ruins. So where did they go? Westward. They had nothing going for them in the South. Their farms were destroyed. And it wasn't only Southerners that moved west of the Mississippi and expanded, but most of them were Southerners. Okay? Well, all of a sudden, instead of hundreds of settlers coming through, we have thousands of settlers coming through, and there were certain branches of those 8 Indian tribes that couldn't take it. Now, you know, it's okay if hundreds are coming through. We can live with that, but when thousands start coming through after the Civil War, because they had no life for them at that point, Native Americans became very concerned, because obviously you don't mind 1 or 2 people hunting in your 5-acre hunting area. Maybe you can, you know, part with that. But all of a sudden when you got 55 or 60 coming through there, that's going to cause you a problem. And so the concern arose among Native Americans when that happened. Well, because of that disruption of their way of life, there were 3 very powerful Sioux Indian leaders that made the decision that they would no longer abide by the Fort Laramie Treaty. What's that? I think we did a little bit, yeah. That S. There you go. So because of their disruption to their way of life after the Civil War, when thousands and thousands of settlers started coming through, there were 3 specific Sioux Indian chiefs that refused to continue to abide by the Fort Laramie Treaty. And I think we did talk about this, Brianna. I think it was Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse. So the 3 Sioux chiefs that absolutely decided they would not abide by this treaty any longer were Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse. Well, I bet that engraved had a lot of energy.
Red Bull, Sitting Horse, Crazy Horse.
Now, basically what would happen is these Indian tribes, the Sioux mainly, but it also resulted in the Cheyenne as well, they would resist westward expansion from 1866 clear into the 1890s. So they had made up their mind that they were not going to be taken advantage of. And these 3 particular leaders influenced not only the Sioux, which was a large Indian tribe, but also the Cheyenne. And they resisted westward movement from 1866 until the 1890s. Now, This is where we get back to where they became a problem and the military decided to step in, and they were either going to contain them or they were going to exterminate them. And that Indian campaign was simply called the Campaign of 1876. And that's when things got a little bit western, and that was the campaign that resulted in General George Custer and his men being annihilated at the Little Bighorn in Montana. And that was probably the most famous resistance that we've ever heard of as far as the Campaign of 1876. And the Campaign of 1876, which I'm not sure how far we're going to get into this because it has to deal more with Montana, as I mentioned, but that whole campaign was set forth to move the Sioux and Cheyenne Indians off the Little Bighorn River in Montana to the reservation. And what had happened is the Sioux and Cheyenne had accumulated all together in a large group, way large group, that Custer underestimated. And when he got there, he still thought he could force them to move, and what happened is they resisted to the end, and the rest is history. And we can give you a little information on that later. Now, one of the forts that was set up by virtue of the Fort Laramie Treaty was a fort called Fort Phil Kearny. Fort Phil Kearny. And in 1866, an Indian victory at Fort Phil Kearny really set the stage for the disaster at the Little Bighorn, because it showed that Native Americans could resist. Now, we're a little ahead of the game because we got to go back and talk about Fort Phil Kearny, but there is going to be a battle won by Native Americans at Fort Phil Kearny that will set the stage for what happens at Little Bighorn and gives Native Americans or Indians confidence that they can stand against white aggression. Okay? All right, that'll take us then to our next subtopic, which is building forts along the Bozeman Trail. Building forts along the Bozeman Trail. Anybody know where the Bozeman Trail goes? Anybody have any idea? It goes by Bozeman, kind of, but do you know where it starts? Where's the Bozeman Trail start? Anybody know? Right here in Wyoming. Fort Laramie. And ends in Virginia City, Montana. So if you look on a map here, you're talking about down here where Laramie is, right? And basically the trail came up through here into Virginia City, Montana, this area here. That was the Bozeman Trail. A lot of people covered the Bozeman Trail. So it was a route from Fort Laramie in the Wyoming Territory to Virginia City in the Montana Territory. Now, right after the Civil War, settlers were moving into Fort Laramie, and then they were traveling along the Bozeman Trail to the gold fields of Montana. That was kind of the thing. That's what people did to try to strike it rich. They went to California, remember the 49ers in 1849, but that was kind of done with. And so after the Civil War, these people that didn't have anything traveled from wherever they traveled east of the Mississippi to Fort Laramie, and then would travel the Bozeman Trail to the gold fields of Montana. There were 3 specific cities in Montana in which gold was discovered for a brief period of time and got everybody excited. That one we already mentioned was Virginia City, Montana. And about 2 miles down the road, so to speak, from Virginia City, Montana, is Nevada City, Montana. And then the 3rd gold field was in western Montana by present-day Dillon, Montana. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that area. And that was called Bannack, B-A-N-N-A-C-K. So the big gold fields at the end of the rainbow, so to speak, of the Bozeman Trail were Virginia City, Montana. About 2 miles away from Virginia City is Nevada City. And then on the western part, southwestern part of Montana, near Dillon, Montana, was Bannack, B-A-N-N-A-C-K. It's kind of interesting because Virginia City is still there in Montana. It's kind of between Bozeman and Ennis, Montana, in the southwestern part of Montana. It's pretty well preserved. I mean, it's kind of a touristy area, and you can go visit it and see Virginia City, which was a booming town in those days, and then you can go down the road 2 miles and see Nevada City. Everything pretty well put together there. Bannack is a little less reconstructed. It's more of a there it is type thing. But if you ever get into Montana, I don't know if you folks go that way or in the Bozeman area, if you ever had a chance to go to either Virginia City or Nevada City, they're kind of cool. They're kind of built back up to the way they were at the time. Now, basically what happened is I don't know if you remember this name, but you remember a Civil War general by the name of John Polk? Wasn't very successful. He had lost the Second Battle of Bull Run for the Union, just to refresh you. He was given orders from Washington, D.C. to establish 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail. He was the guy given the job after the Civil War to establish 3 forts on the Bozeman Trail, virtue of the Fort Laramie Treaty. He was the one that was supposed to get that taken care of. And General John Pope, if you remember, was the losing commander at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and it'll be his job to establish these forts. And Austin mentioned this, the 3 forts would be built for 2 specific reasons: to provide protection to the white settlers that were traveling the Bozeman Trail, and then to provide winter quarters to the white settlers that were traveling the Bozeman Trail, or a stop off or a place they could stop and rest. Now, one of these forts that we're going to talk about, because it's right in your neighborhood, was in the northern part of the Wyoming Territory, and it was named Fort Phil Kearny. Now, I'd be really impressed if somebody picked this up. It was named after someone that we talked about this year, but it, we didn't spend a lot of time. Does anybody know who Phil Kearny was? Anybody remember that from our lectures?
Wasn't he a poet?
No, he was a general, military man. What did he lead forces in? Which conflict? Fort Phil Kearny.
1812.
After War of 1812.
Mexican War.
There we go. He was a commander in the Mexican War. Remember, he went from Missouri to California. We didn't talk about it a lot, so I'm not overly disappointed you don't remember, but it was named after Phil Kearny, General Phil Kearny, who fought in the Mexican War. Remember, he led American victories at Santa Fe, New Mexico, and San Diego, California, if you can remember that. Now, Fort Phil Kearny, and maybe you geographically had been in the Sheridan area, you would know these places, but it was built along the Big Piney Creek and the Little Piney Creek near Story, Wyoming. Any of you kiddos been to Story, Wyoming? You ever been to Sheridan? Just keep going a little bit farther, not very far, and then you can drive into Story. Okay? So Fort Phil Kearny would be built along the Big Piney Creek and the Little Piney Creek near Story, Wyoming, which is just a few miles from Sheridan. You just continue down the interstate, you'll see a big sign that says Story next right. And it's a brown sign. Why is it a brown sign?
Historical?
Because it's a historical sign, yeah. Okay? Now, the army that will inhabit Fort Phil Kearny will be the United States 18th Regiment. The United States 18th Regiment would be selected to inhabit Fort Phil Kearny. So Fort Phil Kearny will be inhabited by the United States Army 18th Regiment under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington. So again, the U.S. Army unit that will inhabit Fort Phil Kearny near Story, Wyoming will be the United States Army 18th Regiment under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington. Now, Carrington had big responsibilities here because he had not only the command to be responsible for the fort, but he was going to be responsible to watch it being built. It just didn't show up, it had to be built. And so his first job was to pick a site where he would put the fort. So this guy was from the ground up. He picked the site, his men built it, and then they inhabited it and used it for the purpose in which it was built. Now, you want to pick a good site? You pick probably the most famous scout in Western U.S. history to help you find a good spot. And who was that?
Jim Bridger.
Jim Bridger, very good. So Colonel Carrington is going to be responsible to choose the site for the fort. So he enlisted the help of historic Western scout Jim Bridger to have him help him find a good spot for this fort. Well, they look around a little bit. Boys, you'll have to pay attention to this because this will be a reality for you someday. They look around for a little bit, and finally Colonel Carrington chooses where he's going to build Fort Phil Kearny, but it was not endorsed by Jim Bridger. Jim Bridger did not think it was a good spot. He thought that the local hostile Indians would be a problem both during and after the construction of the fort. Do you think some of these Indians want these forts built even though they signed a treaty? No. They don't. They're going to resist a little bit. So as Jim Bridger's looking around with Carrington, Carrington settles on a spot that is not endorsed by Jim Bridger. That'd be like paying a lawyer a lot of money and then not taking his advice or her advice. That doesn't make a lot of sense. If you employ the greatest Western scout of all times and he says, you know, I think this is a bad spot because I think the Indians are going to harass you not only during the building of this fort, but they're going to continue to harass you afterwards. I think that's a bad spot, and he doesn't take his advice. And Jim Bridger is going to be correct. Now, why did he do it then, boys? Why did he pick that spot? If Jim, that's right. His wife was tired of traveling around looking for this spot, and she thought it was rather pretty there. So Carrington folded to the pressure of marriage.
So don't listen to women.
and he picked that spot because his wife, A, was tired of looking, and B, she thought it was very pretty there. So despite the fact that they would be under constant harassment by Native Americans wasn't in her thought process, and Carrington picked it because of it. It's like when if you ever build a house, you get married and build a house, you know what your job is in building that house?
Sign the check.
Write the checks. Yeah. We built a house, tour. If you can survive building a house, you can survive anything in marriage. And so my wife, I just wrote the checks, and then once in a while I'd say, honey, I know it's tough, but you got to pick the counter. The guy can't move forward unless you do some picking here. So I just wrote the checks and groveled most of the time, but it worked out pretty good. We built two. So Carrington decided that his wife's happiness was more important than the safety of his men, evidently. So he picked that spot for that reason. Now, Colonel Carrington was an interesting commander. Most military historians would say he was soft. Okay, he was really soft.